Hello, welcome to Module 2, Section 1, Lesson 1, the nervous system. So Module 2 is looking at all of the neuroscience systems, and this specific section we will be focusing on the nervous system, the brain, its components, and its functionality. So the overview of this section begins with the nervous system. The next lesson will be on the brain, and then we'll look at biological neural networks, and we'll finish this section off with microstructures of the brain. So let's take a look at what we already know from the previous module and lessons. What we've established already is the interdisciplinary aspect of neurotechnology, right? It's borrowing ideas from all of these other disciplines and fields like computer science, linguistics, psych, data science, biology, and so forth. So within all of these disciplines, we can create this intersectionality of what we call neurotechnology. And it really requires understanding of the nervous system. This is the basis of neurotechnology. So that goes into the second point, that neuroscience is the framework for understanding the brain. So if you're to think about the brain as the physical aspect and neuroscience can explain the physicalities of the brain, then doing things with the brain, to the brain, and for the brain becomes easier when we understand the physical aspect of what we're working with. So this is why we're spending some time going over the neuroscience, nervous system, anatomy, and physiology of the brain and the nervous system. So the main questions we're going to seek to answer in this lesson are, what are the major components of the nervous system? How does it break down into smaller subsequent systems? How do these components work in isolation and work together to compose the entire nervous system? And what type of systems within the nervous system allow us to function? So this means looking at the individual system and understanding how that system in specific contributes to the overall function of the human brain, of the human nervous system, and just human action in general. So here's a diagram that splits the nervous system into multiple parts. So the first division is between the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system. And if you look at the body on the left, highlighted in this like peach color is the peripheral nervous system, and on the right, highlighted in green, is the central nervous system. So this is a good visual representation to have as we continue to talk about these systems in this lesson. So for the peripheral nervous system, you can see it's broken into another two divisions, the autonomic and the synaptic. So the autonomic controls internal organs and glands, and somatic is more of sensory information. And you can see that because somatic splits into sensory input and motor output. So it's taking this information in, making sense of the information, and then relaying that to motor output and moving in cause of this sensory input. Autonomic splits into sympathetic, which is rising up, and parasympathetic, which calms you back down. And central is brain and spinal cord. So you can see peripheral is more of the body, central is more of the brain and the connection, which is the spinal cord. So now let's break the central nervous system into a few components. So we have the brain, which is really just the control of all of body movement, of body information, sensory input, motor output. All of this relates back to the brain, where all of this information gets digested and gets relayed back out to the body. The spinal cord is the communication pathway between the body and the brain. So we have these neural circuits up in the brain, and they are relayed through the spinal cord, which connects the brain to the rest of the body. And then we have cranial nerves, which provide motor and sensory supply to the neck and head. So these kind of play into the back right here. As for functions of the nervous system, we can split this into two parts. So again, the central nervous system is mainly composed of the brain and the spinal cord. So the brain's function is the main unit of control and connection for the various subsystems of the nervous system. So again, it's really the headquarter for all of this nervous function. And then spinal cord is that communication pathway between the brain and the body. it's relaying information bidirectionally. Before we go any further, I would like to take a second to define what nerves are. Nerves compose many aspects of the peripheral nervous system as well as communicating between the peripheral and central nervous system. So we can define them as a bundle of fibers that are composed of neurons and surrounded by a sheath. And again, the function is a connection unit. So similar to how the spinal cord is a connection unit for the brain and the body, the nerves are a connection unit between the peripheral nervous system and the body as well. So here's just the general function of the peripheral nervous system. So if we think about the spinal cord and brain categorized in the central nervous system, and then we have the body, which is made up of the limbs and organs. What is allowing these to communicate? How are we getting information from one to the other? And that would be the function of the peripheral nervous system. And if we're to think of this as an electrical grid, then the central nervous system would really be the powerhouse of this grid, and the peripheral nervous system can be thought of as the electrical cables. And it's helpful to think about analogies in this sense to understand the functionality of the nervous system and the subsystems. So, like we were just saying, that there's this communication that's happening between the body and the brain. And how is this happening? Well, between the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system, and their subcomponents is what allows it to communicate. So there's two pathways. There's the pathway moving from the body to the brain, and then the pathway moving from the brain to the body. So body to brain is afferent pathway, and an example of this would be sensing temperature. So we have sensors on our skin and underneath that can pick up on the temperature, and this information is sent to our brain, and our brain is making sense of, oh, it's moderate temperature today. And then we have the efferent pathway, which is moving from the brain to the rest of the body. So this is away. And an example of this would be blinking. It is sending the signal out. Okay, now I need to blink because various reasons of why you need to blink. And yeah, you can see on this diagram here, we have skin, and then that moves to the brain on the right. And you can see that they drew the image of the spinal cord rather than the brain, but remember that the spinal cord is a communication pathway to the brain, so directly will communicate that information up to the brain, and then you see that that information is communicated back down to the muscle. So a really interesting application of a lot of the subsystems we just talked about is neuromusculoskeletal prosthetics. The nice thing about this application is that it's pretty self-explanatory from the name. So let's break this down. Neuromusculoskeletal. So neurons, muscles, and skeleton. So really what's happening here is that it's the prosthetic that is connecting to the individual nerves, muscles, and skeleton of the individual. So we are basically maximizing the points of connection between the prosthetic and the human body. These nerves are then stimulated by pressure and contact on the prosthetic. So let's say that I have a prosthetic arm, like from my elbow down to my hand. It's completely prosthetic. By applying pressure and contact on the prosthetic, there are nerves between my arm and the prosthetic that are being stimulated within this process, which is then by the pathway that we just talked about, afferent pathway, that information will get sent up to my brain for processing, making sense of this pressure that I'm feeling on my stimulated nerve. And then, if we go back again, the efferent pathway can send information back out to the prosthetic and move the prosthetic, the neuromusculoskeletal prosthetic. So the really cool thing about this is that it's not only connecting like physically, but we are allowing for those electrical connections between the nerves and the prosthetic. So just to summarize, we covered a decent amount of material in this lesson. The nervous system is made up of the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system, which have certain pathways to communicate, afferent and efferent pathways. And the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system can be broken down into subsequent systems and made up of different physiological and electrical parts within the body. Once we understand how these all work together, it makes more sense to then look at how neurotechnologies play into these nervous systems. The neuromuscular prosthetic neuroskeletal-muscular prosthetic um, works with both the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system by allowing for communication, by connecting to both the nerves and the muscles, as well as the skeleton. So by maximizing these points of communication, we are able to send more information to the brain and allow the brain to send more information to the prosthetic. So in the next lesson, we're going to take a look at the whole brain concepts and how the brain functions as a unit, and then breaking that unit down into little parts of the brain, how each of these lobes and systems within the brain function as well. So reminder that this section has an assignment correlating to it, so be sure to complete that, and thank you all for listening, and I will see you in the next lesson.